Hello there and welcome back to the returning viewers, and to the new viewers, welcome. I do hope you guys enjoy this one. It is a really special one to me because it's the first time we're getting the test bench in action, and it's been a while since I've received it, and now we can actually start to look at it. Now we're going to be reviewing the Z690 Aorus Pro, and very big thanks to Aorus for sending the components to make this possible. But in conjunction, we're testing out the Waterforce X360 with the motherboard. Now the main focus is going to be on the motherboard, and also we're not really looking at the motherboard, and I'll tell you why. Because we don't review motherboards, we review the motherboard's ability to bring out the best in the components, as well as the stability of the components over stress, like gaming, benchmarks, and rendering. So that's going to be very important to note when we are checking this motherboard out, is how do the actual components stack up. To let you know what components we've used, it is a 12700K from Intel. We do have a 6600 XT from Gigabyte, as well as a Aorus NVMe, which is PCIe 4. It's the 7000 series, which is the 7000 write, 5500 read, as well as the RAM, which comes from Kingston, which is the CL38 at 4800 megahertz. It is the Kingston Fury. So these are the components that went into it. Now we are going to be looking at the design, we will look at the specifications. More importantly, we're going to be looking at the performance as well as the software. But as is normal, let's not look at the motherboard a little bit closely, but let's look at this whole unit a little bit closer. Starting off with the design, this is an ATX board, but in today's market, the board is actually relatively unassuming compared to what we see in other Z690s. I don't mean this in a bad way, I just mean that the layout is pretty plain with regards to looks. With regards to the rest of the layout, it is pretty standard. However, because there is no CMOS clear button, I love the fact of where they place the CMOS battery, because it's on the lower right hand corner, which means that you can access it easily if you do have a fail post, you're trying to overclock, and you do need to reset your BIOS. So really love that about the design on this board. Right next to the CMOS battery, you do have the Q flash button, which is in a bit of a weird spot to me. It's generally at the back of the board, but it is there. So if you are looking to flash the BIOS, you are able to just open your case, push the button, and flash that BIOS. The general placement of these boards with regard to the fans, the power, everything is actually quite nice, and even on the test bench, as you can see above me, that is generally spaghetti everywhere, and on this it even creates a nice looking aesthetic. So in a case, it's going to look even better with regards to the layout for cabling. Looking at the memory DIMMs, these are shielded, which you don't generally find in a mid-tier board, and we also have the first PCIe, the X16, which is shielded, which is obviously there for reinforcement. With regards to cooling, we do have fully covered MOSFETs, and that's integrated into the IO shield, as you can see there from the left to the right, or covering that whole top left section of the board. So I can tell you, because I've read it on the performance, that it is effective. Looking closer towards the bottom of the board, we do have slots for 3 M.2s, and now that does have a dedicated shield for at least all 3 of them, but for the first one dedicated, the second one you'd have to take off, as well as the Southbridge chipset does have a heat shield on it as well. At the top right hand side of the board, we do have an LED indicator, which is becoming pretty much standard on boards, but again, nice to know what's going on with regard to the board if you just look at your manual to know what type of error you might be experiencing. This is more specs rather than design, but looking at the back of the motherboard, you see that you have one combo for your headset and microphone. Now, these are generally separated on motherboards, and this is more typical in the layout of a laptop unit, but it's just something to be aware of. So if you do have an older generation headset that separates your headset as well as your microphone, you are going to need to get something that combines them, but those do exist. Lastly, on design, if you look at the AIO, it's actually a really brilliant design because the power for the AIO goes back through the cables into the radiator. All of the fans and the RGB elements are daisy chained together, and you only have two elements that you need to connect to power the entire system, which is an eSATA as well as the USB to control the lighting in the AIO. Moving on to specs, and there's only a couple of things that I do want to highlight on specs. For the rest of the input outputs, I will bring up a graphic and you can pause it just to see all of those. However, the things that I want to highlight firstly is the CPU support. So this supports 12th gen, so any 12th gen chip. However, if the rumors stay true, this will also support 13th gen or Raptor Lake, which is going to stay on LGA 1700. Next, the RAM, 4 DIMM slots in dual channel. Now this says that it can support up to 6300 in overclock, and we are seeing better and better RAM coming out every single week from the different manufacturers. So really excited to see if this board can do it, but for the meantime you will see what overclock I achieved in my performance. Next is connectivity. So this has Wi-Fi 6, not Wi-Fi 6E, as well as Bluetooth 5.2. Now on Ethernet, this has a 2.5G and no 5G, but again, this is a mid-tier board. One thing that was a slight disappointment for me was the lack of Thunderbolt 3 or 4. However, there are two consolation prizes. The first being that the frontal and the rear is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2, which delivers 20 gigabits per second. So not bad, but it also has the ability to have add-in cards which are Thunderbolt capable. Lastly, on specs that I'm going to mention, the graphics card PCIe is PCIe 5, so you are safe for next gen with regards to graphics cards, but the M.2s are PCIe 4, which is not really a train smash considering PCIe 4 can deliver up to 7,000 megabytes per second. Now let's move on to the IOs with the graphic.
Doodly doo doo doo, chilling music. Doo 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 doo.
Moving on to softwares and features. Now, the Gigabyte software is really basic, but it's actually really effective. I did have issues only with the RGB Fusion 2.0, in which the header for the AIO stopped working, but after a delete and reinstall, it was working, and I didn't have that issue again. So Windows does do the bulk of the heavy lifting when it does come to updates. However, because I'm reviewing this board, I only use the software from the website. Obviously, I did use Windows updates, but you had to download those one by one, which was a little bit tedious. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into the digital world, and I'm going to show you all the software that you can use with this motherboard.
We are going to start off with the Aorus App Center, as it's pretty much the central hub for all the individual softwares that you get, starting with the BIOS. Now, the BIOS can be updated from the desktop and it will restart for you, and you have different functions to be able to see which BIOS version you are on, as well as which server you would like to update from, as well as being able to update from a specific file that you may have downloaded from the Gigabyte website. Next is EasyTune, which is a really cool software to be able to show you what the current frequency of your RAM, as you can see there at the bottom, as well as your CPU clock speed, currently sitting at 4900 megahertz. And you will be able to see your voltages as well as your CPU temperatures. If you do have fans inside the case, you'll be able to monitor those as well. And also, changing from default to overclock with a simple click will push the CPU to 5.1 gigahertz. By clicking on the little heartbeat at the bottom right hand side of EasyTune, it'll bring up the hardware monitor, which will give you a lot more information as to what's going on with your system. Further to EasyTune, you do have the ability to have advanced CPU overclocking as well as RAM overclocking and power overclocking, all of which is done inside EasyTune, and then your system would restart in order to propagate the changes. In the interest of saving time, I'm just going to tell you about the other functions, which is a fast boot RGB Fusion 2.0, SIV, as well as smart backup. Fast boot obviously making your boot faster, as well as moving on to the RGB effects. You can change the motherboard or anything that is plugged in and synchronized. The system information viewer does calibrate all your fans should you have fans, and you can see the individual measurements of those. If you guys do want to see something a little bit more elaborate and longer, I do have all of this recorded, so I'll be able to share that with you, as well as seeing there you can change the fan curves.
Moving on to performance, and before we jump into the charts and the results, I must note that no overclocking was done whatsoever, except for when I did an overclock and stress in Aorus 64, and I will mention that when we get to that part. But the reason I'm saying this is because board installation, everything done, and literally updates, and these were the results that we got. So we are going to start off with Blender. Now, as you can see with FishyCat Blender, we got a time of 154.57. With regards to the best, that was 141.962. Then the worst, it was actually 600, but I couldn't take that as a valid result from the submissions into Blender. 294.185 was the second worst, so I took that one. But I took literally all of the submissions ever done, and I created through some really tricky Excel an average of 157.936. So overall, it did really well in FishyCat. Moving over to BMW, same principle, 107.75. The best was 99.52. The worst, 208.776. And then again with tricky Excel, 122.9857. Again, noting that this was just stock performance. Cinebench had some really interesting results. Again, no overclocking. The result for multi-core was 22913, which beat CPU Monkey's 22812. I have put the 11700K as well as the 10700K as well as the 5600X there just for reference. CPU-M means CPU Monkey. On to single core performance, we hit 1953, which was short of the 1939 of CPU Monkey, and then all the other results there follow. So this means that we hit the relative scores that we should hit with a CPU in base performance. Moving on to Geekbench, and what I did in order to get a comparison was I took the lowest and the highest results with regards to the first page, which is 50 submissions. So in single core, we hit 15674, lowest 10076, and highest 17713. On multi-core, a little bit closer towards the results, we hit 1913, the lowest seen was 1585, and the highest 2096. Again, no overclocking. Moving on to Aorus 64 cache and memory benchmark. Now, it must be noted that this was not in the 4800 MHz standard for the RAM. I had clocked this to 5066, and I did have that stable. I did try push it to 5200. It did post and it was stable for a while, but I did get quite a few errors. So I did manage to find the sweet spot at 5066 for this RAM. And as you can see, the read, write, and copy profiles were quite good. Moving on to Aorus 64 GPU benchmark. The reason I did this test, even though I had an RX 6600 XT, was to show that this board can pull the full complement of this graphics card, which it did. It is PCIe 5, so as we do get better cards, we will be testing this motherboard with different cards, so stay tuned for that. And as mentioned earlier, it is PCIe 5, so you are next gen safe. Looking at Crystal Disk Mark, the read is 7047.29 and the write is 5435. Now, what this device is capable, according to Gigabyte Aorus, is the read is capable of 7000 and the write is 5500. So, as you can see, overperformed on read and slightly underperformed on write, meaning that this motherboard can get the full complement from this SSD. Moving on to the temperatures, and this is more of an indication of the Waterforce X360. We did see good results in Blender, hitting an average of 69 but a max of 86. Cinebench on multi was an average of 70 and a max of 86. On Cinebench single, 35 and 60. CPU Mark 57 and 74. Geekbench 40 and 76. Now, as we saw with the results, the motherboard does have the ability to bring out the best in the 12700K, but we also do have effective cooling with the X360. Moving on to Aorus 64 system stability test. Now, this is where it gets extremely interesting, but let's look at the normal test. Normal being no overclocking, the CPU was at stock and the RAM was at stock. And you can see Really good temperatures coming, considering Ada is extremely stressful on a CPU. We do have good nominal or average core clocks as well as low temperatures. But let's move on to overclock. Moving on to the stability test done with overclock. Now the CPU was set to 5100 on all cores and the RAM was set to 5066 from 4800. Now the temperatures obviously look atrocious, but that is because it's being pushed. What we need to note from here is that we had good average clocks, but I actually did this test for 10 minutes and I closed it down by accident and I had to do this test again. At no point did the PC fail or turn off, even though the temperatures were spiking and I was having thermal throttling up to 40%. So this is a good indication of a good motherboard that was holding both the CPU as well as the RAM stable, backed up by that X360. In conclusion, with regards to performance, we can see that this board performed extremely well in base, but even in the overclock with regards to Ada 64, it still held its own for a mid-tier board. It was really surprising results and I was really impressed with it. What was even more impressive is something small, but the AIO does have a temperature reader which you can see in the LCD, and that was always literally 1 degree off of what Ada said the temperature was. So really good to note that the temperature that you are seeing on your AIO is very accurate. It is time to conclude, and we're going to conclude by getting the negatives out of the way first. And the first one is lack of Thunderbolt, which is a big one, especially for me, and that's because the type of devices that I use and the type of devices that I test. So this may not be a big one for you, so take that into account. But there is a consolation prize in the fact that you do have a frontal and a rear USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2, which is capable of delivering 20 gigabits per second. The second is the NVMe support is at 4.0, not 5.0, but this is not a big one because you still have the complement of 7,000 megabytes per second, so it is not that big of an issue for me, might be for you. The last one is pretty much standard across the industry, is that the software does have bugs in it. I did say that the Fusion I did have to reinstall, but otherwise it was pretty good. I just have to note it because I did have to reinstall it, and it wouldn't be a proper review if I didn't tell you that I had an error on it, which I did. Otherwise, we have to look at the price. Now, is this board well priced? It comes in at 7,300. Is that a good price? No. Is it a good price relative? Yes, because we have to look at the price of Z690s with DDR5, and this actually comes in at a really good price, especially with what you're getting. But the most important part, or the thing that I love most about this board, is that I was sitting with the overclocks and I was worried, is this computer going to shut down? And it really held its own. It really brought out the best of those components. As we can see, the NVMe hit 7,000 megabits per second or megabytes per second. It really allowed every single component to perform at its best, and that is exactly what you want from a motherboard. It doesn't look bad, it really looks nice, especially with the X360, which also performed well. So in my opinion, a really good motherboard, and it really blew my expectations away. It is the first motherboard that I've fully tested on a Z690 when I'm actually testing the full complement, but honestly, from what I've seen, this is really good value for money, especially if you're looking to get into 12th gen and 13th gen with that support coming. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed this review. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Cheers and goodbye.